Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Sako. I am the interim director of the National Center on Improving Literacy, and I'd like to welcome you here to our Reading the Room series. Today's topic will be explaining IDA's new definition of dyslexia. We're so happy you could join us today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are the National Center on Improving Literacy, and we're a partnership among literacy experts, university researchers, and technical assistance providers funded from the U.S. Department of Education. We are operated by the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, with partners from the Florida Center for Reading Research at FSU and RMC Research Corporation. Our mission is to increase access to and use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach pre-K to grade 12 students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. Our 5 priority areas are focused on evidence-based screening and assessment practices, instruction and intervention, family engagement, technical assistance, and dissemination. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this event, Dr. Nancy Nelson, who's assistant professor at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and also serves as a deputy director for the National Center on Improving Literacy. Nancy?
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today as well. Starting with Dr. Hugh Katz is a faculty member in the School of Communication Science and Disorders at Florida State University. His research interests include the early identification and prevention of reading disabilities. Dr. Nadine Gabb is the Silvana and Christopher Pascucci Professor in Learning Differences at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the director of the Gabb Lab. Her research focuses on typical and atypical learning trajectories from infancy to adolescence, with an emphasis on language and reading development within a learning disabilities framework. Dr. Charlie Haynes received his doctorate in education from Harvard University and is professor emeritus at MGH Institute of Health Professions. His research interests are focused on cognitive and linguistic assessment and predictors of reading in different world languages. And Clarice Jackson is a nationally recognized literacy advocate and dyslexia consultant. She is the convener and host of the Black Literacy Matters National Conference, founded Nebraska's first dyslexia-specific tutoring and advocacy center, and president of Decoding Dyslexia Nebraska and the Reading League Nebraska. Thank you all for being here and participating in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yep, good to be here.
So I want to start the conversation today by laying some groundwork. Charlie, why was a new definition of dyslexia necessary?
Well, the previous definition was framed in 2002. Hugh was actually in the group that was involved in that. And the new definition reflects what we've learned about dyslexia over the past 20 years. Over that time, research across languages has shown that dyslexia is universal. It can look different depending on the writing system, for example. I'll talk about that later. We also know that it involves multiple interacting influences. I know Hugh's going to address that. It's not a single cause. Other key points that we've learned is that in old practices, old diagnostic practices involved looking for an IQ achievement discrepancy, IQ reading achievement discrepancy. And that we've realized that's not supported by evidence. For example, I know that will be emphasized more. The revision brings the definition in line with current science. And we've tried to make it more useful for the kind of broader dyslexia community, educators, clinicians, and families. So in short, it's about updating the definition to match what we now know.
Great. And could you briefly comment on what the process was that was used to update the definition and how stakeholders were involved in that process?
Yeah, we employed a process that was broad iterative and data-driven. Our emphasis was on bringing together first a steering committee and then a larger advisory committee that included not just researchers, like the original group was very research heavy for good reasons, but we wanted to include not just researchers, but educators, clinicians, and parents. We gathered input through iterative surveys, discussions, and then many of you participated in a public comment period. We had over 3,000 responses, all of which we analyzed and used to refine the definition. We also, another important piece is that we had people who spoke. About a third of us were bi or multilingual, which lent a more kind of international or global perspective. So all of this ensured that we believe ensured that the final version reflects both research and real world perspectives. So, in other words, it wasn't done by a small group of largely monolingual Caucasian scientists. It was done by a much broader group. We hope that it will shape the field moving forward.
It was clearly a thoughtful process and a very large undertaking for all of you. So getting into the substance of the definition, Hugh, can you comment, and Nadine as well, what would you say are the prominent changes in the definition? And when you're commenting, could you please attend to the role of phonological awareness, morphological awareness, neurobiology, and cognitive referencing in your response?
Sure, Nancy. We made a number of changes in the definition, as Charlie said, on the basis of research that's happened since 2002, when I was part of that group that framed that definition. You mentioned morphological awareness, that was added to the definition primarily because of the role that morphological awareness deficits play in languages that have the orthography maps onto the morphemes in the language, like Chinese. I'll talk a little bit about whether it's relevant for alphabetic languages when you ask other questions. But we also reduce I guess, the prominence to a certain extent of phonological awareness and morphological awareness, in the sense that the definition now says that those conditions are common but not universal. And that's because group research primarily was what we were using back in 2002, which showed if you compare two groups of individuals, dyslexic versus non-dyslexic, you'd see a large group differences in phonological awareness and other phonological processing activities. But we began to look at individuals who had dyslexia and recognize that not all individuals had problems in phonological awareness or other aspects of phonological processing. And we found individuals who have deficits in those areas but don't end up with dyslexia. So we changed the definition to indicate that it's no longer a necessary or sufficient condition. You don't need to have deficits in phonology to have dyslexia. We don't know as much about morphological awareness yet, but we assume that we're going to find the similar types of things. The other major change that Charlie mentioned had to do with what's called cognitive referencing. The previous definition said that problems in phonological processing and in word reading were unexpected on the basis of other cognitive abilities. But those other cognitive abilities have been indexed primarily by IQ. And IQ really doesn't tell us much about how well someone should learn to read words. It's more important for understanding and comprehension, and it's just a minimal amount of information it tells us about word reading. So using it in a discrepancy formula is proven to be inappropriate for identifying kids that we might be able to help. Plus, we've got research that shows that persistently poor readers who have lower IQs are very similar in terms of the word reading problems they have, the underlying cognitive deficits, their brain basis of the problem and the response to intervention. So we've taken that out in our definition, and most of the definitions that are currently in use do not include anything about cognitive referencing. And I'll let Nadine speak to other changes such as neurobiological changes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so the original definition had a reference to a neurobiological origin. And so we carefully looked at all the evidence. And as you know, my co-committee members already suggested, it's a multifactorial, problem. There's many different factors that interact with each other. There's risk factors, there's protective factors. And so overall, similar to what you said, if you look at a group of children with dyslexia and a group of children without dyslexia, you do see atypical brain development overall. But that atypical brain development is not deterministic. It's probabilistic. It just adds to the many factors that interact with each other, leading to problems with reading. And so we don't have the sensitivity and specificity right now to see dyslexia on one brain scan. So you cannot put someone in an MRI machine and look at the picture and say this child has dyslexia. Overall, as a group, we do see differences, but there are many different factors, and so that's why this reference to a neurobiological origin as the number one cause or main cause has been taken out of the current definition.
That's a great clarification. Thank you. So obviously this new definition has some implications for assessment. Hugh, taking it back to you, based on the new definition, what would you say the critical areas are for dyslexia screening, and is morphology a recommended area of screening?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to take it back further that screening is really part of a process in trying to identify kids so that we could provide intervention. And the model that I've used and others, Nadine in particular, is a preventive model in the sense that what we'd like to be able to do is identify kids at risk early on and provide appropriate interventions so that we prevent the serious reading problems and secondary consequences. And the definition does have provide some direction for how that might be done. And it could be done prior to school, but the definition indicates that one of the earliest indicators of kids that are at risk are differences or problems in the development of oral language, that oral language difficulties foreshadow later reading problems. Right, so we can identify that prior to kids starting school. We don't mention it, but family history would be another early indicator. But the primary definition, primary characteristic of dyslexia in the definition is word reading difficulties and speed and accuracy. So once instruction's underway, the best indicator of children's later difficulties learning to read is their current difficulty in the process of learning. So we would want to include in the screeners measures of word reading speed and accuracy, including non-word reading ability. Prior to that, we can look at some of the pre-literacy components, such as letter knowledge, letter name, letter sound knowledge. We specify in the definition that phonological awareness is often a characteristic. So we could, screening battery would include a measure of phonological awareness. Question about morphological awareness is we have pretty limited data at the moment how you would use that in a screener. We've had over 40 years of looking at phonological awareness and letter naming as predictors of later performance. And it seems to be from a number of studies in English that morphological awareness shares quite a bit of variance with phonological and letter naming. So it might not tell us all that much more initially let's say in kindergarten, for example, beginning of first grade. But my guess is that as children begin to confront more morphemic words, we might begin to see that we could put that into a screener, but how you would do that in a timely fashion, because we want screeners to be brief in nature, only a few minutes, and so forth. No. Nadine, you have any other things about would help with screening in the definition?
I think overall we just want this to be more of a preventative education definition that really informs identification of children who are currently struggling, but also preventing kids from struggling overall. I think that is, the key goal of this, new definition.
It also the thanks to Nadine who fought for this point within our committee was that at the end of the definition we actually state that early identification and support for kids that are at risk is an important step in prevention, and that's kind of unique to definitions, but in our feedback from the public, that was the number one aspect of the definition that they thought was important to be added.
Yeah, I love that addition, and also that it, just supports the idea that there should be an action taken after there is any sort of assessment, and also it also recognizes that there's not a limitation on early intervention. So we don't just intervene early; we can also support students later in life, but intervening early is highly powerful. Can the two of you also comment? I hear a lot of issues in the field about sort of confusion around universal screening for reading risk and dyslexia screening. Can you comment on the differences between those two?
Yeah, I mean, if you mean the universal screening, something like Dibbles or Ames Web screening, which has been common from a number of years. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, 20, 30 years ago, those were introduced as ways of monitoring progress and screening. What turns out they're measuring the very factors that are the characteristics of dyslexia: word reading accuracy and fluency, as well as non-word reading accuracy and fluency. So they could be part of screening for dyslexia. In fact, they are being used as screens within state law for screening for dyslexia. We would probably want some other things to be included within that. I didn't mention before, but given that early language impairments precede later reading, we would want to perhaps have a measure of language within our screening measure, not only to identify dyslexia, but also as a potential indicator of developmental language disorder, which is another prominent learning disability that affects academic performance.
Great. Annie Dean, do you have additional comments on that?
No, I think, it's important that, we maybe also distinguish between screening for dyslexia and screening for dyslexia risk. So when we screen for risk, we are trying to identify children before they get a diagnosis, similar to preventative medicine, right? You're screening for heart disease risk, but you're not seeing a cardiology and don't get a diagnosis. And so I think, it's important to communicate to all stakeholders, including parents, but also teachers, and all, involved parties, that there's a difference between screening for the risk and, a diagnosis of dyslexia.
Yeah,
That's great.
and those screens are probabilistic in nature. So we're not saying if you fail a screen, you're gonna have dyslexia. It's not deterministic in that fashion. So we're interested in what the probability that this child is going to have later difficulties, and based upon that, we determine the type of intervention we might do, um, and and we can interpret that based upon scores that might come back from screening.
It sounds like
Well,
you're suggesting, oops, please jump in.
no, one thing that's kind of refreshing is that for when we identify a child at risk and implement more kind of broad-based support for them, it doesn't have a negative effect. If let's say we've falsely identified, they're at risk, but they're not really going to end up having dyslexia. The things that we do for the children don't harm them. They actually will help any child. So that's a concern that some parents have, that, oh, you're gonna falsely identify my child as being at risk. But in fact, what we do for kids is uh, provide them with a kind of broader based support, and then also diagnosis, which you're very much involved in, Nancy, I know.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, and it also sounded like you were talking a little bit about scores and recognizing that kids' scores vary and dyslexia exists on a severity continuum. Can you describe that and sort of what that means then? If dyslexia exists on a continuum of severity, how do we identify it?
Yeah, that was added into this definition. We actually knew that back in 2002. I don't know how we missed the importance of putting in that. I guess practice had not uh, identified that as an important component, but research had shown us that the primary characteristics of dyslexia, that is word reading accuracy and fluency, exist on along a continuum. There's not kids, we don't find kids that have a reading problem versus don't have a reading problem. Ability is on a rather normal continuous distribution. And so, as a part of assessing reading, then we're going to need, if we want to do a categorical type identification, we need to make some particular cutoff that would indicate that that's reading below that level. We don't necessarily have to do that, right? Because knowing where the child is on the continuum has implications for what you might want to do to help them learn to read, right? And that if a child that's above that cutoff has still might need additional resources, but the systems that we set up are binary in nature to a certain extent. Public law makes that, demands that of us, that identify conditions. Um, and most of us who work in the area of dyslexia would think about the word reading problems in dyslexia as being much more severe than sometimes conveyed. We hear this 1 in 5 individuals have dyslexia. It's probably the case that the term is probably better used for kids that are more severe in nature. Down 10th percentile, 5 to 10th percentile is what you hear sometimes. That's only part of the diagnosis, however. It's just not simply reading at the lower end of the distribution. It's persistent reading at the lower end of the distribution. So attempts have been made to provide good instruction for the child, instruction that assures that their peers are learning to read. And here's a child who's had that instruction and is not progressing like their peers. And perhaps some in the multi tier system, they've had some additional small group work or whatever, and they're still not responding. And plus, we might rule out other conditions that might explain it, like quite a bit of absentees or medical conditions or unaided hearing problems and so forth could be part of the diagnosis. But it does occur along the continuum.
Great, thank you. So I also want to talk about how the definition might vary for different languages. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the webinar. So Charlie, can you comment on that? How does the new definition impact assessment across languages and orthographies? Oh, Charlie, you're on mute.
Sorry, one thing that's important to realize is that if we have a sort of English-centric perspective, and the majority of the research has been done on English up until, 20 years ago, really, we get a picture of dyslexia that is not universal. But what's important to note is that dyslexia is universal, has universal characteristics. Nadine and colleagues, brain work has shown some kind of universal characteristics within the brain, what's activated, what isn't. And also just behavioral studies have shown that there's certain kind of universals. But how it shows up depends on the writing system of the language. So for example, in more consistent writing systems where a letter fairly consistently represents a sound and vice versa, the difficulties often appear as sort of slowed reading. So they're primarily speed related. But in English, we know that they often appear in both slow reading and inaccurate reading. So the definition really encourages us to interpret assessment results within the context of the language the student is learning. That requires us to be more thoughtful, to be more reflective, to make sure that we're taking into account sort of what the student's L1 or their first language is, and the language in which they learned to read originally. But across languages, the focus remains the same, word reading and spelling. It's just those speed versus accuracy considerations seem to be really important. So we adjust how we interpret the results. It's not, we don't know what we're looking for. We adjust how we interpret results. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. So I want to pause and hone in on one part of the definition, and I'm going to turn it over to Clarice to comment on this. But the definition indicates that the causes of dyslexia are complex and involve combinations of genetic, neurobiological, and environmental influences that interact throughout development. So what is the implication of this statement in the definition? What does it mean for environmental and multilingual challenges, and do those necessarily rule out a dyslexia diagnosis? Clarice, can you comment on that?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Um, what I would say is in the federal definition of the IDEA, it has what has been a persistent and highly harmful um, um, prerequisite for minority families specifically, who are largely low income and may experience some traumatic issues that some families don't experience who are not in such poverty. And with that, it's the exclusionary factors. And the exclusionary factors prevent what would normally be what most people would screen for and test children for that would become dyslexia or say that these are the characteristics of dyslexia. For a black or brown student, specifically more black people, black students, they're excluded based on environmental factors that have nothing to do with the science of reading, access to reading, or even understanding that they have dyslexia. And so that was one of the key highlights that we discussed very thoroughly and with great concern and detail in the revision process. And we wanted to make sure that we were not giving the message that we were in support of something like that. We are acknowledging that environmental and neurological things happen in this whole process, and that in combination, not isolated and not excluding populations that are in great need, if not more. If we look at the national statistics, whether it's dyslexia or just below basic in reading, according to the National Assessments of Educational Progress, we see that 85% of all Black students in every state in this nation are reading below basic. And that should be alarming to anyone. And when we talk about how reading is in everything that we do, um, crime included, and health costs and all of that, we really need to take a look at who's at the bottom of that. We need to raise literacy rates for everybody. However, we need to have a more targeted approach for those who are most vulnerable or at the margins of access. And this particular definition is trying to hone in and define it more clearly so that there is no confusion, because we need to exclude those factors and get to the heart of why children aren't reading.
That clarification and summary is very helpful. Thank you. I want to think also about some of the policy implications of the new definition. So Charlie and Clarice, I'll give it to both of you to sort of go back and forth on these questions. But we know that the previous definition currently exists in policy for some states. What are your thoughts on shifting policy, and how do you think this will impact dyslexia screening, instruction, intervention, and maybe even eligibility for special education services?
I think full disclosure with being the chair of the parent and community engagement piece of this process and talking to parents and advocates alike, I think the wise thing to do would just be to allow what is already existing in legislation to remain and allow those that are at the top, as Hugh and Charlie so eloquently put, they're the researchers, the scientists, they're doing their thing up there, and they want you to, and Nadine as well, they want us to fully envelope what this update is doing and what it's not doing. And to not be resistant to the change, but understand we're shifting with the science. And then based off that, as you navigate your local policy, I'm in a state in Nebraska where local control is everything. And so I'm sure that's in a number of states. And so they're really very personal about what particular happens in their state. They don't care about what's happening in the nation. And yes, they pick up a lot of things from other states, but I think we should hold and pause and just learn what this new definition really means, like listening to this particular webinar and other opportunities, and then asking the questions, and then from there you can make a determination on what needs to shift within your local policy network, and then federally, do that as well. I think that there are a number of conversations that still need to be had, and some conjoining together and partnering together that needs to happen since this revision has come out. And I think we're just in the process of starting to have those conversations. And then I think we can come up with what is a fair assessment, um, whether it's your local legislative interpretation that you have now, which everything can be approved. We always have to upgrade something. So I think this definition really serves as an upgrade and an equalizer and an evaluator of what is now, what could we improve, and how do we see these things coming together to make literacy the primary target and the primary reason why we're all in this work for the children.
I thank Clarice. It's fun to tag along with you. Uh, I just wanted to emphasize something that you got at really, and that's that the definition doesn't change policy directly. You can't put policy, rarely would actual policy be included in a definition. But as you've very eloquently pointed out, it can guide better policy over time. So it supports. I just wanted to hammer home another important point is that it supports moving away from this sort of outdated IQ discrepancy models that exclude a lot of kids uh, in ways that can be very harmful. And it moves toward earlier identification that Nadine has wonderfully been emphasizing. And also, as Hugh alluded to when he was talking about the kind of instruction and the persistence over time, that it's moving to more like response to effective instruction. That seems to be a really important piece that I think will kind of play out in policy, uh, leading to policies that emphasize screening, timely intervention, more flexible eligibility decisions. The changes are going to, unfortunately, for those of us who are so into it, advocating for kids and families and so on, I think the changes are going to be, unfortunately, gradual,
Mm, mm,
but the direction is toward aligning policy with current science. So the impact of the definition is indirect, but it's potentially very meaningful. And I think folks like Clarice, who I just have extraordinary respect for you, Clarice, for what you've been doing. I think that you and so many of us who are advocating for parents, that it can create a really potentially very meaningful, the definition can create a kind of environment where meaningful change can happen.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, and
At the base,
obviously, go ahead,
go ahead.
Clarice, please.
I was just going to say at the base level for parents, at the end of the day, once we do all the things that we did when we came together very thoughtfully and intentionally about revising the definition, this has to live on the ground, and it lives with parents who are walking into their local schools, trying to navigate a system for their and the definition, and then trying to take that in and explain to some people. I know we've made a lot of progress, but a lot still needs to be done. So trying to explain to teachers and special education people and principals who don't go through special education knowledge or have the science of reading at their disposal yet. We're just now starting to see those strides and having to try to interpret for them what we have created in a definition, and then trying to get that to guide an IEP or guide a reading program for a child who is struggling, who doesn't want to come to school, who's bullied, who believes that they're stupid or something is wrong with them. And so when we look through that lens and that frames, this work is important, and we are here to ensure that it gets what it needs to have happen for parents across the nation.
You took it exactly where I was going. So asking about the role of families and all this. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Um, we have a few more minutes for our discussion before we go to Q&A. So I want to turn the topic to something that's really important to me, which is instruction. So obviously the definition is the definition that's guiding what might happen in policy and assessment for instruction. So when we think about instruction, particularly given the role of early intervention in the new definition, what does that mean for our instructional systems and these prevention models? How does it help or hinder early identification and intervention in school settings? What does it mean for effective instruction? And so on and so forth. So this is open-ended for everybody to sort of jump in, and it's to help me out.
I can address the part about screening and the implications for screening. I'll let Charlie or Nadine talk about intervention, but I think it does give us some direction of where to go for screening. There's quite a bit of variability across the country in what the policies are and what's going on. I mean, I just read a paper today that was sent to me that Nancy, you were an author of, talking about the variability across states, and it's pretty significant. And I think the definition and the papers that explain the definition, Charlie Malt and I have a paper that should be available in the next week or two, open access on Annals of Dyslexia, where we talk more specifically about guidelines for screening. But I think it provides information that can help set up screening policy. One of the things I see happening is we're creating batteries that are way too long. We got too many measures in it just because everybody wants to have their particular thing measured. And what we want to have is an instrument that's brief and provides an indication of risk quickly.
Yeah, it has to be feasible to implement and not take away from instruction, right?
Right.
Other comments on the sort of prevention, the role of instruction in this space?
I think that even though the definition can't specify sort of procedures, programs, and so on, kind of lay out all of the sort of evidence-based methodologies that we know are so important, that it points people towards word recognition and spelling, towards looking at speed and accuracy within a kind of larger diagnostic context that you're so familiar with as a
Yeah.
diagnostician, and that intervention is necessarily for dyslexia, particularly, is necessarily going to need to focus on enhancing accuracy and speed of word recognition. This is not new, it's not novel, but over time we've developed a lot of evidence on how to best do that through sort of structured literacy approaches. So there's the definition is there, and then there's all of us who need to kind of move forward the way that we're doing right now, kind of advocating for support for parents, for good early identification, good support for parents and families, for teachers and schools, improving what schools of education are doing, how they are training literacy interventionists. That's all the kind of our work as kind of a united, a largely united group of individuals moving forward to support people with dyslexia.
Yeah, great. Nadine, do you have any thoughts on sort of just thinking about that and the prevention systems in schools?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really important that we move from a, reactive to a proactive model. And I think that the definition is now modernized and sees both the reactive part, like, this child is struggling. How do we find kids who are struggling? What are we, doing in response, but also the proactive part. So really to address the dyslexia paradox, the discrepancy between when someone is identified and when we know that intervention is most effective. I think most importantly is the multifactorial component so that we're not just getting stuck on one factor, but really seeing the whole child and the environment in which the child is embedded in the school as well as in community as being, supportive, but also can, contribute to risk as well as protective factors.
Yeah, and that role of go Charlie, go ahead and
Yeah,
jump in.
no. I think Clarice was pointing toward that, Nadine, where she was saying that these kind of, Critchley in 75 articulated these exclusionary factors. And they were beautiful. They helped us say, at the time we thought they were beautiful. They helped us say, this is specific developmental dyslexia. But in fact, over time, we've realized that when you exercise that, you actually end up identifying a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people, and you're inadvertently maybe excluding people who are bi or multilingual, people who are have a lot of environmental challenges, uh, often not of their own making, that are influencing their literacy learning. Uh, so that I'm like Clarice, and I think that this is really shared by all of us, that I'm hopeful that actually more children, that dyslexia can be identified in more children so that we can give them the kinds of supports
Yeah.
that they need.
Yeah, dyslexia risk could be identified in more kids, and the point is that the kids that Charlie described, the latter set of kids he described, are intervention is nearly as effective, if not as effective, for that group as it is to that very specific group that Crixley identified and kind of historically has been the group of kids that have been identified as having dyslexia.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was very striking to me. I don't know if you remember that, Charlie, but when we walked out of the hall at IDA, after presenting the definition for the first time, I was approached by a policymaker from a state who said to me, "Oh my God, I think we need to like change our flow chart now with the exclusionary criteria, and make sure that these exclusionary criteria are not." Determine anymore who gets services and who doesn't. And I think it already, has these implications across the country and frankly, the world.
Yeah, that role also, so thinking about how we can, he was commenting on this, the role of identifying risk earlier, being able with the purpose of being able to provide students with a sort of just-in-time instructional support that they need to hopefully not ever, need more intensive intervention and provide the instruction that students need when they need it. That's really the goal of our educational systems, from my perspective. Like Sarah, I think that there were some Q&A questions that you were going to turn over to us.
Yes, thank you. Um, we had a very active Q&A. So I'm just going to pick a couple to highlight for our panelists to answer. So the one question is, how does the new definition align with findings about the science of reading and efforts to ensure effective reading instruction for all students in every classroom?
Well, I think Nadine or Hugh could answer that as well, or maybe even better than I can. But the the what that question has embedded in it, the applications or implications of the definition, whether they're policy, whether they're intervention, their diagnosis, so that the definition itself, just by virtue of the fact that it's a definition, it typically it can't include the sort of level of detail that you're talking about. It doesn't specify evidence-based programs, as I noted earlier. It doesn't talk about teacher training. It doesn't talk about all of these other elements that your wonderful question alluded to. That's really the work that we need to do. We tried to hint at those things through words like effective instruction and support for families, but it's really our work as advocates for children where we uh, need to continue to push for more evidence-based approaches and so on.
Thank you, Charlie. Another question came up. Can you speak to orthographic difficulties in the definition?
Hmm.
You, we've had
No, it
so
sure
many
is, Charlie.
discussions
We,
about
we we
that.
had we had lengthy discussions about orthographic processing as a potential characteristic of dyslexia, and it turns out that orthographic refers to the symbol system of the language and how the symbols represent aspects of the language and whether there's difficulties in kids learning those. And certainly that's the primary thing that characteristic of dyslexia is problem learning how at least in alphabetic language, how the sound system is represented by the characteristics. So by nature, it's an orthographic problem. The term sometimes is used to refer to difficulties learning what the sequence of letters might be within a word, independent of the sound structure of the language. And there's fair evidence that those types of problems are present in languages that have that are a little bit more opaque, like Chinese, where characters are not as consistent. We represent the sounds of language. We're still trying to understand at least I am, and many colleagues are trying to understand what orthographic processing might mean within alphabetic languages. And it may indeed be the case that there are some problems in learning the orthography that are not based upon problems with understanding how the sound system works.
And Tomohiro Inoue, Eric Treatise, and a number of others have helped to develop guidelines for translating, but not just translating, adapting the definition to other languages and um, uh, to help account for possibly varied levels of importance of orthographic processing. So a definition, if you included everything that is important in a definition, it would be like an encyclopedia. And I think Hugh, you were really helpful in saying, look, it's got to, for it to be useful, it can't get beyond a certain size. We got to just make some decisions on what appears to be the most quintessential. But our colleagues in Hong Kong uh, uh, have adapted the definition, and it's largely identical to the definition that we have right now, but it does include difficulties in orthographic processing because, as Hugh noted in Chinese, the the evidence so far is indicating that it seems to be a kind of have a it's very high in level of importance. So it was an addition to the definition when it was done for Chinese.
We have time for one more question. There was quite a lot of mention around exclusionary criteria or exclusionary factors and the impact they've had in the past in the field. So could the exclusionary criteria that has been used in the past be explained or examples being given?
I can
Yeah,
start a little
yeah.
bit.
Go
So,
ahead, Nadine.
yeah,
It
yeah, yeah.
sounds like they're looking for like a list of the sort of classic kind of Critchley exclusionary factors, maybe.
I think in the past, and Julie Washington has always said that, right? You cannot be black and dyslexic. You cannot be poor and dyslexic. You cannot be multilingual and dyslexic, right? And you cannot be like deprived of, rich language environments and be dyslexic. But these were all exclusionary criteria that prevented you from being dyslexic, having a dyslexia diagnosis. And so I think this new definition now says, yes, you can be multilingual and still have a learning disability. Yes, you can be poor and still have a learning disability, right? It's not causing it. It's not, it's just one factor. But it was an exclusionary factor before, and it just excluded a large proportion of kids and really made it like a less inclusive and more selective definition. And so I think this new edition tells us that we have to look at all kids and still follow the specific factors that we pointed out, like persistent word reading, etc. But these, exclusionary factors cannot be used to deny services to a large group of kids, especially minority and underrepresented groups.
Yeah, and that's nice. We're not saying that it's not biologically based, that it's not a genetic or neurobiological basis to it. It's just that you can't rule it out on the basis of some of those exclusionary criteria, because individuals who've had a limited resource upbringing um, uh, also could have the biological conditions that lead to the same types of problems that kids that haven't had those experiences, and they benefit from the same type of instruction. And it's kind of history that's led to that. I mean, when kids were first recognized as having dyslexia, they were really smart kids that stood out because they weren't doing well in school. And so we spent a long part of the history of dyslexia focusing on those kids and not recognizing that kids that have other characteristics can have the same problems and benefit as well from intervention.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their perspectives and experience, and our attendees for participating today. You will receive a recording of today's event, and it will also be posted on the NCIL website. A brief feedback form for the event will automatically launch in your web browser when you leave the webinar, and we kindly ask that you complete it then. To stay abreast of the latest NCIL news and information, please follow us on Facebook at Improving Literacy or on X at NCI Literacy, and sign up for our newsletter at improvingliteracy.org. Thank you again for joining this Reading the Room event and your interest in understanding IDA's new definition of dyslexia. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much.